When people think of medieval warfare, they usually picture swords, shields, and heavy armor. But a lot of the gear that actually kept soldiers alive almost never shows up in movies. Today, we're looking at the medieval soldier equipment you rarely see on screen, and why those overlooked pieces mattered so much in real battle. Number 1. The layer under the armor. The first thing movies usually skip in medieval warfare is the layer under the armor. A lot of people picture a knight pulling on metal and being ready for battle, but real protection started with fabric. Under mail, men often wore padded or quilted garments to soften impact and make the metal bearable for hours. In earlier and transitional periods, heavily quilted fabric armor, like the gambeson, could even be serious protection by itself, not just underwear. Once plate became more advanced, the key underlayer was the arming doublet, a fitted, padded garment built to work with the harness above it. That matters because armor was not just about stopping a cut. It also had to spread force, reduce rubbing, and keep hard edges from tearing up the body with every step, turn, and hit. The Met even notes quilted leggings and quilted garments of differing length under mail, which helps explain why a real soldier looked more layered and bulky in practical ways than the neat costume version people are used to. So, when movies show smooth plate sitting comfortably over a tunic, they skip the part that made the whole system usable. The glamorous piece was the steel. The practical piece was the padding. And that tells you something important about medieval Europe in general. Soldiers were not walking around as metal statues. Their equipment was layered, adjusted, and built around movement. In some periods, that padding might be a gambeson. In others, a more specialized arming garment. And the quality could vary with status and money, but the principle stayed the same. Soft materials were doing hard work.
That is also why the idea of armor as just an iron shell misses the point. Tailoring and textile work were part of combat equipment too. A man in the 12th or 13th century wearing mail and a man in the 15th century wearing a full harness were separated by centuries of change, but both still depended on textile layers nobody on screen wants to dwell on. That hidden base is one reason real armor was more sophisticated than the movie version. Number 2, the strings that held it together. Once that padded base was on, the next hidden piece was not another plate. It was cord, laces, and attachment points. Movies often make armor look like one shell that clicks into place, but real plate was a collection of separate parts that had to be suspended in the right spot. The arming doublet had eyelets, and the harness was tied on with arming points, basically strong pairs of strings. Those points held pieces where they needed to sit, let weight rest on the body properly, and kept the armor from sliding all over the place when the fighter ran, mounted, or swung a weapon. This matters because good armor was as much about fit as metal thickness. A badly placed elbow piece or shoulder defense could ruin your reach. A loose leg harness could drag and twist. Because the harness was built from separate pieces, it was also more adjustable and more modular than the movie version makes it look. A fighter was not stepping into one metal tube. He was wearing a system. In practical terms, that means armor had to be fitted to a body, not just to a rough size. Once you understand that, the old movie image of an armored man barely able to move starts to fall apart. A real harness was supposed to move with the body, not trap it. In fact, museum experts point out that a fully armored knight was expected to mount and dismount without being lifted by a crane, which only sounds surprising because film and pop culture trained people to imagine armor as dead weight. Even more interesting, by the later 15th century,
Arming points had become familiar enough in Italy that civilian clothing copied the look, which tells you people recognized them as a sign of chivalric status. So, one of the least cinematic parts of medieval soldier gear was actually one of the most important. Without the ties, straps, and suspension system, the shiny outer shell does not really function the way people imagine. The armor worked because it was engineered as a wearable system, not because a blacksmith made a hard suit and called it done.
Number 3. Mail where plate could not go.
And that leads to another thing movies get wrong. When full plate arrives, mail does not simply disappear. It retreats into the gaps. In the early period, mail could cover huge areas of the body, including shirts, hoods, attached gauntlets, and mail leggings called chausses. By about 1200, mail chausses were already commonly worn by mounted warriors, which means the classic knightly look was more complete and more all over than a lot of films show. Later, once plate enclosed more of the limbs and torso, mail kept doing the jobs rigid plates could not do neatly. Separate mail sleeves could be worn with a cuirass. Mail gussets protected the armpits and the crooks of the elbows. Mail breeches, called braettes or pairs of paunces, could protect the groin for men fighting on foot. The bassinet could also carry a mail curtain, the camail, hanging from the helmet down over the neck and shoulders. In other words, the story of armor is not mail versus plate, with one side winning and the other vanishing. It is mail and plate working together. That layered logic is one of the smartest parts of medieval equipment design. Solid plates were great at presenting a hard, angled surface. Mail was better at covering flexible, awkward, high movement areas where the body had to bend, breathe, and keep its reach. It was the answer for the places a single rigid shell could not neatly solve. Mail lingered because it could fold, compress, and recover with motion in ways a rigid plate simply could not. That is also why museum collections preserve so many separate mail components instead of just one standard shirt. By the late Middle Ages, armorers were using mail almost surgically, placing it exactly where a rigid harness needed help and avoiding useless bulk elsewhere. So if you want to picture a serious late medieval man-at-arms, do not imagine only polished breastplates and leg armor. Picture little islands of mail everywhere the body bends, turns, lifts, and twists. That is what real battle kit looked like when armorers were trying to close every opening without freezing the man inside it. Number 4. Armor that looked like clothing. Once you notice that armor was layered, another missing movie item makes a lot more sense. The Brigandine, and its earlier relative, the coat of plates. A lot of viewers expect torso armor to look like one big shaped breastplate, but some of the most practical body defenses looked more like tough clothing. A Brigandine was built from small plates riveted inside layers of fabric. In some surviving examples, the only obvious clue from the outside would have been the pattern of rivet heads. Some pieces, or fragments, even retained textile coverings like velvet, which means a soldier's torso protection could read from a distance as a rich garment rather than exposed metal. The coat of plates worked on a similar principle, though the forms changed over time, and some early examples combined overlapping internal plates with larger breast elements and decorative metal borders. This type of armor became important in the 14th century, when stronger crossbows and changing battlefield conditions pushed armorers to reinforce the torso with more rigid protection. The real surprise is how modern the logic feels. Instead of one huge shell, you get many smaller plates sharing the work under cloth. That gives structure, overlap, and in many cases, easier repair or replacement. It also reminds you that medieval soldiers did not all look like identical chrome statues. In a real medieval army, especially in later medieval Europe, you could see plain plate, fabric-covered plate, mixed mail and plate kits, and helmets of very different types,
all in the same wider military world. And Brigandines were not just a brief stop on the road to full plate.
Museum pieces date well into the late 15th and early 16th centuries, which shows the design stayed useful because it solved a real problem well. Visually, that matters more than people think. A Brigandine wearer could look fashionable, wealthy, practical, or plain, depending on the cloth, finish, and fittings, not just heavily armored in the modern fantasy sense. So when a movie jumps straight from a male shirt to full shining plate, it skips one of the most interesting middle steps in armored combat, and one of the clearest signs that medieval armor was as much tailored equipment as it was forged metal.
Number 5. Tiny plates for dangerous gaps.
From there, the most revealing gear is often the smallest.
Real armor paid obsessive attention to weak spots, especially places where a blade or point could slip in when the arms moved. That is where you find bessajus, armpit defenses that many viewers do not even notice when they appear in manuscripts or museum displays. They can look like odd metal discs hanging near the shoulders, so films usually leave them out. But their whole existence tells you how carefully late medieval armor was designed around dangerous gaps. Museums also preserve separate male armpit defenses, which makes the same point from another angle. The area under the arm mattered enough to deserve its own specialized pieces, not just one general layer over the whole body. This is one reason movie armor often feels wrong, even when it looks impressive. It focuses on big silhouettes like the helmet, breastplate, and shoulder pieces, while the real craft of armor often shows up in the places where the body opens. Medieval soldiers and armorers knew that a harness did not fail only at the chest. It failed at the seams, the joints, the pivots, and the points where mobility had to be preserved. And that is a big lesson for understanding armored combat in general. Late medieval weapons and fighting methods often aimed at exactly those openings, because attacking straight through the strongest part of the plate was not always the smartest choice. Real armor could spend surprising effort on a spot small enough to cover with your hand, because that was where a fight could turn in an instant. So some of the smartest gear in medieval Europe was not the largest item on the body. It was the little add-on plate, or mail patch, that closed the exact gap an opponent would hunt for. That is a detail movies almost always sacrifice, even though it tells you more about real battlefield thinking than another oversized shoulder plate ever could. Number 6. Helmets that worked in pairs. Helmets are another place where movies flatten everything into one familiar shape. Medieval Europe used a lot of helmet forms, and many of them only make full sense when paired with other gear. In the late 14th century, the bassinet became a close-fitting helmet, often paired with a camail, a curtain of mail hanging from the chin area down to the shoulders, and many examples also carried visors. Later, the sallet became one of the major helmet types, but the word sallet covers a wide range of 15th century helmets. Some were open-faced, some had visors, and many left the lower face and neck exposed. That is why the before matters. It protected the chin and throat and worked together with the helmet, rather than replacing it. Some surviving sallets have short pointed tails, some have very long tails, and some infantry styles are much simpler, even cap-like with cutouts for the ears, which is a good reminder that not everyone on a medieval battlefield looked like a tournament knight. The same goes for the chapelle de fer, or war hat, a wide-brimmed practical helmet that shows up far less in fantasy cinema than it should. If a film gives every soldier the same dramatic great helm shape, it erases one of the most obvious truths of medieval warfare. Equipment depended on date, role, and region. A helmet that offered excellent protection but miserable vision or breathing had its place, but not in every kind of fight. Variety was not clutter. Variety was function. Even within 1 century, a German sallet, an Italian sallet, and a simpler infantry helmet could produce very different silhouettes. So when modern media compresses them into one generic medieval helmet, it hides how adaptable the real equipment was. The broader point is that helmets were part of systems.
A movie may show one dramatic full-face helm and call it medieval, but real soldiers used combinations that balanced vision, breathing, coverage, and the type of fighting they expected. Once you understand that, a sallet and before, or a bassinet and camail, stop looking like odd museum labels and start looking like smart battlefield engineering. Number 7. Shields that changed jobs. Then there are shields and smaller side pieces, which movies often handle in the simplest possible way. People picture every medieval fighter with one big shield, then assume shields disappeared once plate got better. The real story is more specific. For heavily armored knights, improved body armor reduced the need for the older battle shield, and smaller targes were increasingly pushed toward tournament use. But shields did not vanish from medieval warfare. They changed jobs. The pavis stayed important for infantry, and especially for crossbowmen. Some pavises were small enough to carry in close combat, others were large enough to cover a crouching man, and some were fitted so they could stand on their own or be carried while reloading. Royal Armories even notes that smaller pavises could hang on the shoulder while reloading, while larger ones could hide a man almost completely. In other words, the shield did not become obsolete across the board. It became specialized. At the other end of the scale, the buckler remained useful for personal defense with the sword, and one of Europe's earliest surviving fencing manuals is specifically about sword and buckler. That tells you a lot. Medieval soldier gear was not moving in one straight line from shield to no shield. Different fighters kept different tools because they solved different problems. The same broad battlefield could have men sheltering behind pavises, others carrying bucklers, and others using no shield at all because their armor or role called for something else. A mounted man in advanced plate, a town militiaman, a crossbowman behind cover, and a swordsman in a close fight did not need the same answer. So one of the biggest movie mistakes is making medieval equipment look standardized. In real Middle Ages warfare, the forgotten gear is often the gear that tells you exactly who the fighter was, how he expected to fight, and what kind of battlefield he was walking into. And sometimes the most revealing item is not a sword or a breastplate at all. It is the humble shield, carried in a very specific way for a very specific fight.